They said the earthquake erased San Francisco. That is the version they wanted you to remember. The fires, the collapsed buildings, the 3 days of smoke visible from 100 miles away. That story has been repeated so many times, it has become the only story. A city destroyed, a city rebuilt. A clean narrative with a clear beginning and a definitive end. But clean narratives are almost always hiding something underneath them. And in this case, underneath is exactly the right word. Because when the ground split open, and the recovery crews descended into the wreckage with orders to stabilize and prepare for rebuilding, what they encountered below the destroyed Victorian surface had nothing to do with earthquake damage, nothing to do with any construction period San Francisco officially acknowledges, nothing to do with anything in any city blueprint or municipal record from any era anyone could name. What they found had been waiting down there long before San Francisco existed, and the internal documentation from that period kept returning to a phrase that should have launched a serious investigation, but instead quietly disappeared into the filing system along with everything it was describing. Pre-existing tunnels, unexpected depth, origin unknown. Sit with those 3 words. Origin unknown. Professional engineers writing official documentation about infrastructure discovered beneath the city they were hired to rebuild, and the most precise language they could commit to paper was origin unknown. That is not a technical limitation. That is what careful language looks like when the people using it understand exactly what they are looking at, and understand equally well that saying so directly would open a door nobody in authority wanted opened. Something was down there, and the people who found it made a very deliberate choice about what happened next. But first we need to talk about what survived. Documentation did survive. Not the comprehensive, organized record that should have been produced. Fragments. Individual pieces scattered across different archives in ways that feel less like disorganized record keeping and more like someone ensuring the full picture could never be assembled from any single location. Images showing what the crews actually encountered underground, workers positioned beside structures that make their scale look entirely different from what you would expect in a city supposedly founded during the Gold Rush era, vaulted spaces with arched ceilings demonstrating geometric precision that engineers examining these records today still struggle to reconcile with the construction capabilities officially attributed to that period. Brickwork with joint tolerances suggesting manufacturing consistency that the accepted timeline of San Francisco's development has no room for. Surfaces that look less like manual craft and more like the output of a systematic process operating at an accuracy nobody has adequately explained. And then there is the detail that changes everything else. The alignment. When the recovery crews mapped what they were finding underground, the layers did not behave the way subsurface layers in a normally developed city behave. In cities built across multiple eras by different planners following different priorities, the underground record is chaotic, contradictory, a physical archive of decisions that don't coordinate because they were never intended to coordinate. What sat beneath San Francisco coordinated perfectly. Every layer, every depth, every period of construction the crews could identify, all of it following an identical grid, the same orientation, the same underlying geometric logic running continuously from the deepest levels up through construction periods separated by decades, as if the geometry of this place was established once, at a point that predates every date the city's official history is willing to name, and every group that came after built within a framework they may not have understood but could not escape. That is not how cities develop naturally. That is how cities develop when something already organized the ground before any of them arrived. Hold that, because what came next pushed even further past what the accepted framework could absorb. Below the aligned passages, the crews found chambers, not service tunnels, not utility corridors, actual rooms, proportioned spaces with vaulted ceilings demonstrating mathematical consistency that reconstruction engineers kept returning to in their notes because they could not reconcile it with what was supposed to have been buildable here at any point in documented history. Some chambers had been sealed with such thoroughness, packed with material compressed to a hardness initially registering as solid bedrock, that crews didn't realize what they were dealing with until they broke through. When they did, the interiors had the quality of spaces deliberately closed and left entirely alone for a very long time. Exactly how long nobody wanted to formally calculate. Then the vertical passages appeared, cylindrical shafts descending beyond depths the crews could always fully measure, classified afterwards as geological features or early well construction. But the geometry doesn't support either explanation. Wells are not perfectly cylindrical across significant vertical distances. Geological formations do not maintain that dimensional consistency. These shafts held their circular cross-section with a precision implying tools operating with tolerances the Gold Rush era was never documented as possessing. Some were large enough for several workers to descend simultaneously, others reduced in diameter in patterns suggesting intentional engineering for functional purposes nobody in 1906 could identify, and nobody since has convincingly explained. Private correspondence from workers who encountered these structures uses language notably different from the official documentation. Engineered passages, constructed with deliberate purpose, built for something specific. For what specifically remains an open question with no official answer. Then the rails surfaced, fixed metal track embedded in tunnel floors at depths inconsistent with any rail infrastructure San Francisco has ever officially operated, not scattered, not randomly placed the way abandoned equipment gets left behind. Organized, directional, following routes with the systematic intentionality of a transit network functioning beneath this ground long before any transit network was constructed above it. The official explanation pointed toward forgotten mining infrastructure, but these rails appear in areas with no documented mining history. Their arrangement has the coherence of planned infrastructure rather than the improvised pragmatism of extraction operations, and they align with the tunnel networks around them with the same geometric logic running through every other layer of what was down there, which is when the picture becomes impossible to look away from. And they align with the tunnel networks around them with the same geometric logic running through every other layer of what was down there, which is when the picture becomes impossible to look away from. What the reconstruction crews were moving through was not a collection of unrelated anomalies. It was a system. Underground infrastructure organized around a consistent geometric principle, built across multiple apparent construction periods, all of it coordinated, all of it pointing towards something unified beneath this ground that the official history of this location has never acknowledged and has never had to explain. Until the earthquake made explaining it unavoidable. For a few months, and then something happened that is more revealing than anything the crews actually found underground. The sealing began. Not at the end of a thorough investigation, not after documentation had been completed and findings properly recorded. Immediately, with a speed and targeting specificity that the structural safety justification offered afterward does not account for. Standard practice in responsible excavation prioritizes documenting stable, intact structures before addressing damaged, unstable ones. You seal what is dangerous. You study what is sound. The reasoning is not complicated. What happened beneath San Francisco followed the opposite sequence. The oldest structures went first. The chambers with the most precise construction were filled before comprehensive documentation could be completed. In cylindrical shafts were blocked. The rail networks were buried. The passages extending beyond the excavation perimeters into unmapped territory were closed without any record of what they connected to or where they led. And the written record shrank in direct proportion to how significant the findings were becoming. Early documentation reads as routine, factual, procedural. By mid-1907, the same writers were producing entries structurally designed to communicate as little specific information as possible, as if documentation itself had become something requiring caution rather than thoroughness. The photographic record narrowed simultaneously. Wide framing capturing the full scale of these underground spaces gave way to tighter framing showing less context. The report that should have synthesized the documentation never materialized. The photographs that survived ended up distributed across separate locations in ways that make them individually ambiguous and collectively incomplete. That pattern does not describe accident. That pattern describes management, because if ordinary explanations existed for what was being found, ordinary documentation would have recorded them. The absence of thorough documentation is itself evidence about what honest documentation would have been forced to say. Ordinary findings get documented thoroughly. Inconvenient ones get buried quickly. And what made these findings inconvenient is not difficult to reconstruct from what little survived. Infrastructure demonstrating geometric organization predating every construction period the city's founding history acknowledges. Chambers built to standards the accepted timeline cannot accommodate. Vertical structures engineered with precision the credited era was not supposed to possess. Transit infrastructure beneath areas where none should exist. All of it unified, all of it aligned, all of it pointing toward a conclusion that required the ground to close back over it as fast as possible. There is one more layer to this, the sediment filling the deepest passages, compressed so densely it required sustained excavation to penetrate, distributed so uniformly that natural water accumulation cannot explain it. There is nothing in the geological or historical record of this location accounting for flooding severe enough to fill underground infrastructure to that depth with that consistency. Which means the filling was not natural. It was deliberate. Done significantly before 1906 by people who encountered these passages and decided they should not be accessible. Who filled them in a way calculated to appear geological to anyone breaking through from above? Who succeeded well enough that the 1906 crews initially couldn't distinguish packed sediment from actual bedrock? Someone buried this before. The earthquake undid that burial temporarily. The reconstruction buried it again. Consider what that sequence implies about how many times this has happened. How many previous groups encountered what was underneath this ground and made the same choice? How many layers of deliberate concealment are compressed down there, with the 1906 layer simply being the most recent and the only one that left any surviving record at all? Because here is what San Francisco actually represents in this context. A city with one of the most thoroughly narrated founding histories in the country. Documented from its earliest claimed settlement with institutional attention that should make subsurface surprises essentially impossible. And yet in the one-moment catastrophe cracked the ground open deep enough to show what was actually there, the trained professionals tasked with documenting it produced language like origin unknown, and then sealed the evidence before documentation could be completed. That gap is not a gap in the geological record, it is a gap in the story we have been given. And the sealing that followed is not a reconstruction decision, it is the story we have been given protecting itself. How many other cities sit on top of something like this? How many other excavations produced private notes saying one thing while the public record was written to say something considerably simpler? How many times has ground been cracked open by disaster, briefly shown what was underneath, and then been managed back into silence before the exposure could be properly documented? After the ancient rain was available for ventilation and then been managed back into silence before the exposure could be properly documented, sealed under a century of additional development. Sitting in the dark underneath one of the most visited cities in the world, the fragments of documentation that survived are still in archives, separated and uncollected, individually ambiguous but collectively describing something the official record has declined to address for over 100 years. The ground holds what the institutions chose to release, and the question left open by what those crews found has never been genuinely answered. It has only been built over. Each new layer of construction pressing down harder on the silence underneath. What is actually beneath San Francisco? What is beneath the other cities? Who organized the ground before any of the histories we have been given even begin? The earthquake opened that question for a few months in 1906. Then the rubble went back in. And what matters now is not what they found. It is why, more than a century later, we are still living on top of the answer, without being permitted to ask what it is.